Okay, today is September 19th, 2015. My name is Mary Teresa Policare, and I'm here with Mike Lizonitz. We're representatives from the Greater Pittston Historical Society. We are here today to do an oral history with Mr. Bernie Stiroh, who has come from New Jersey to talk to us. He grew up in Duryea, Pennsylvania, and he's going to provide us with as much information as he can about Duryea. First of all, I'd like to start out with your family history. Like, where did your great-grandparents come from? What was their country of origin?
Okay, my great-grandparents on my mother's side, my maternal great-grandparents came from Lithuania in 1884. They were really one of the early Eastern Europeans to come to Duryea. They went to Pittston in 1884. They bought their first home in Duryea in 1890, and they were part of the original Lithuanian Duryea at that time. My grandfather was Charles Kazimierz Marcelonis. His wife was Mary Kazakevich, but was Americanized to Kazakevich, and they had, I think, 6 children. 3 died early on, circa 1885, 6, and 7, and then the 3 that were left were Joseph, Francis, and Margaret. And Joseph was my great-grandfather. And his 2 daughters, as I said, were Francis married Jacob McCullen, and there's a street in Duryea named after his father, McCullen Street, right off New Street, and Jake eventually became the chief of police circa 1920. Margaret became a school teacher. She was, I think, the first Lithuanian school teacher in Duryea, and I don't know the exact year she was appointed, but she was a teacher probably into the 1950s. And on my father's side, they were Slovak. They came from Austria-Hungary. The Anthony Stiroh was my grandfather, and he married Suzanne, whichever way you want to put it, Kupcho. And they eventually wound up in Duryea circa 1916. They had 5 children: Mary, Anne, Helen, Joseph, who was my father, and Catherine. And they lived at 416 Columbia Street in Duryea, which was also part of what is affectionately known as Monkey Hill.
Do you know anything about what port they arrived at in America?
Yes, the Marcelonis family arrived in New York. I have the name of the ship. I don't have it in my head, and I actually have their immigration. When they left Lithuania, they went by train or boat to Hamburg, and then from Hamburg they came over here. They got married at St. John's in Pittston. I think it was Father Finian, something to that effect. There were no Lithuanian churches at that time, and their children were baptized in St. Mary's German Church. Why they did not get baptized in St. John's, I have no idea. And then after that, they came to Duryea in, as I said, 1890.
Do you remember them handing down some old family stories?
Absolutely none.
No, okay.
They refused to talk about anything. My sister, Nancy, who was very much into the genealogy with me, had found a bunch of old photographs, and she showed them to my mother and her great aunt and my mother's great aunt, and nobody knew anything. When you asked them where they came from in Lithuania, everybody came from Vilnius. To tell you the truth, a lot of them didn't know where they came from.
Yeah. Sure.
And I think a lot of the early immigrants didn't even know when they were born. So when you look at naturalization papers,
sure,
it says whatever the date is, not necessarily correct.
Yeah. Okay, so they all came and they settled in Duryea?
Correct.
Is that where they all settled?
Yes,
okay.
yes. And my grandmother, who married Joseph Marcelonis, came from Shendo. She came to Wilkes-Barre as domestic at 15. She worked for Dr. Dodson, and then she met my grandfather at a dance in Wilkes-Barre circa 1916, and they got married, and then she came up to Duryea with him.
And what was her maiden name?
My grandmother's mother's maiden name was Bonsevich. Her father was Merkevich, and these are all spells.
Yeah.
I'm phonetically, etc. I don't know. They were settled in Lithuania, which was had a big Lithuanian population.
What kind of work did they do when they came to America?
My grandfather on the Marcellonis side, he was a coal miner, and my grandfather on my father's side, Anthony, worked in the mines and also in the railroad.
Okay.
I remember him as not doing much of anything. He died circa 1952.
Now, did they tell you much about the coal mines? Do you have any kind of information?
Absolutely nothing. They were. I discuss this with my sister Nancy quite often, that if we knew what questions to ask, but we didn't know what questions to ask, and we weren't interested. We were interested in our own lives, making our own way, etc. And if you did ask them, they did nothing.
I think it's like that with every family.
Yes, I think that's correct.
Okay, do you know anything about their living conditions? Like where did they first start out? What street?
Well, I can tell you this, that from checking the different census records on the Marcellonis side, they lived at 97 Chittenden Street. In 1900, I think there were 11 people in there. I know people, they slept, wherever they slept, they had what I call lean-tos attached to the house. And my cousin, Paul Kupcho, who was still lives in Duryea, told me that the Stiroh family, they lived in the chicken coops, and they had these outbuildings. They just everybody got packed in. And the guys didn't have any place to go, and they were happy to be anywhere.
They were in America.
Absolutely.
Okay, what was your mother's maiden name?
She was a Marcellonis.
Marcellonis.
Eleanor Marcellonis. And that's an interesting story, too, because Joseph Marcellonis had Eleanor, Grace, and Bernard, and that's who I was named after. Bernard drowned in 1935 in the Lackawanna River. His body was never found. And that, of course, was a trauma for my great-grandparents. And what's interesting, they never spoke about it. I didn't find out anything probably until the 1960s when I saw a newspaper clipping. Like, once he was gone, that was it. And the firemen and the borough officials in Duryea, in 1935, they dammed the river off. Something similar to the Knox coal mine disaster, where they made cofferdams and to try to locate the body. It was never found. And I did find out from somebody that one of the traditions was that you would float a loaf of bread down the river, and you'd follow the current, and wherever the bread broke, that's where the body was. In fact, after teaching, I'm a former teacher, that's what they did in the novel Huckleberry Finn.
Where did your mother and father live? What was the address?
They lived with my grandparents on 219 Swetland Street up until they died. My father worked in the coal mines. He worked at various places, and he took me one time to the Baker Colliery in Taylor, and I was able to get into the changing room, the shifting shanty, whatever it's called. I found that maybe I was 8 or 10 years old. He worked at Keogh Burge, and my grandfather Marcellonis worked at Number 10 Tunnel. And an interesting sidebar, as he was coming home from Number 10 Tunnel, the body was floating down the river of his son Bernard.
Wow.
They were on opposite sides of the street.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, because the dike that ran from Number 10 Tunnel, you could walk it right by the Giglio's farm up to the Stevenson Street Bridge.
Yeah, the Number 10 Tunnel is right at the turn towards Cox in there, right past where the Lower Lackawanna Sewer Authority is now.
Correct.
Wow.
That was in operation as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
And I think it was, someone told me that you could get, all these tunnels were interchangeable. That you could go from the Halstead Breaker underground to the Barnum, and Barnum to this. It's one big,
Oh, really?
Yeah.
one big labyrinth.
So that mine was owned by, who did you say?
Keogh Burge Coal Company owned the Number 10 Tunnel.
And what was it like in that room that you were in? Were it the changing room?
All I can remember was a brick building with hooks hanging down, where the miners would put their clothes in. The hooks were kind of on pulleys. That's what I remember. And I said it could have been 10 or 12 years old, someplace around there. I don't recall.
Okay.
But I remember my dad stopping in Old Forge for a beer at Vito's, and it was 5 cents a schooner. That's why he went there instead of going to the neighborhood place.
For the cheapest one is, right? So, how many brothers and sisters did you? I know you mentioned your sister.
I have two sisters, Nancy and Susan. Susan was born in 1949, and Nancy in 1953.
Okay.
Susan lives in Scranton, and Nancy lives in Wilkes-Barre.
Are you the older brother or younger brother?
I'm the only one, and I was kind of the fair-haired child because of my uncle drowning and me being named after him.
Yeah.
That was a nice
And
house.
Absolutely.
When were you born?
I was born in 1940, November 12, 1940.
So, okay, what were the conditions when you were a little boy with your house, your church, and church?
Growing up, my grandparents lived on Chittenden Street. They lived across from the Holy Rosie Cemetery. They eventually bought the house at 219 Swelton Street, which was owned by Yadeskis, who owned the bar, which was later on John's in Duryea. And then it was a typical two-story home, 3 bedrooms, living room, kitchen, dining room, cellar. So, and I have very fond memories of it. It was right by the river.
What is your first memory as a child? What do you remember?
My first memory of a child is my Aunt Grace, who was my mother's sister. Her husband was in the war, in World War II. And I remember her stringing Christmas tree lights, probably 1945, let's say, because he was coming home and they were going to celebrate Christmas.
Celebrating his homecoming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, what were some of the games that you played when you were
Well, we played Kick the Can, Relivio, a game, I don't know how it got there or what it was called, but it was spin the guy around by his legs and then eventually let him go. And I remember vividly Nippy Novikowski, who was a great Duryea baseball player, spinning me. He lived in Duryea at the time, spinning me around and letting me go. And I'm still shaking from that incident.
So, okay, so now we're going down the main street, and from when you were a little boy, what are some of the stores that you remember?
Well,
we have the listing
there
here.
are stores, and I was going through my preparation for this, and in the 1940s there were probably 75 stores, maybe even more, and businesses on Main Street in Duryea. And that's in quite contrast to what's there today. A few years ago I was in Duryea on a Friday afternoon. I parked my car, and the only car besides mine was parked in front of Kaminsky's. The street was totally, completely deserted. Yeah. There's every kind of store that you wanted to buy things in.
Do you want to go down some of the list?
I know we spoke with Ronnie Kurlanchik from Kurlanchik Furniture, and she mentioned Levi's Bakery.
Levy's Bakery was just 1 block from my house, not even that. And every Sunday morning I would go with my father and after church, and I'd run in and I'd get the hard rolls. That was the big thing. And I was very friendly with Harvey Levy, who was maybe 3 or 4 years younger than I was. And he tragically died of I forget what, in the early 1960s. It was a great place, Levy's Bakery.
How about Kaminsky's? You talked about Kaminsky's.
Kaminsky's was in the what we call the kielbasi competition in Duryea. It was either we got our kielbasi at either Kaminsky's or at Szymanski's, which was on Pettibone and Dixon Street. And there was a question of which one do you like best.
Okay, now Szymanski's is no longer in.
Szymanski's is long gone. They were on the corner of Dixon Street and Fulton Street, I think it is.
Because Kaminsky's.
They also on the way to Washington School, we stopped there for candy. It was kind of a candy store, a small butcher shop, and that was the extent of that.
What about Goldstein's Market?
Goldstein's, Sammy Goldstein was a great guy. His father, Isaac, I think, is Isaac Goldstein, had his first store on Dixon Street, and that when he was also the cantor at the Jewish synagogue, which was located on Fulton Street. And they had Sammy. My earliest recollection of Sam Goldstein was he had a wagon and he came around and sold fruits, etc., etc., and he eventually had a little store on Main Street in the 400 block where he sold baseball cards. And we always, in 1951 or whatever it was, very close to that, everyone tried to get the Mickey Mantle rookie.
Right.
So we constantly got our allowances and went in there and bought the bubble gum with the bubble gum cards from Tops, ironically, which eventually wound up in Duryea.
Yeah.
And you know, the Tops are so popular and so collectible.
Yes.
And at the time when they were first beginning, nobody really realized how collectible they would become.
If you buy something as being collectible, it's not going to be collectible.
Right.
You have to buy things that weren't collectible and they become collectible.
Yeah.
Okay, what about Lugs Grocery and Appliance?
Lugs was the corner of, it was right across from the Halstead Breaker, and it was on Main Street in the 700 block. And they started out as Trim and Lug, a store that was originally a company store, and I think it might have been over in Simpson's Patch, and eventually moved over to the location. It's across from the convenience store today in Duryea. And they started out as foods, groceries, etc., and then it eventually became appliances. I know they sold refrigerators, stoves, Westinghouse. It was a very popular store.
What about Kurlanchik Furniture?
Kurlanchik's, my grandmother shopped. She was Lithuanian, and she had a very good relationship with Jake. Jake was the original owner, and Jake had Ben, and then I think Priscilla and Ronnie went on from there. And I remember very clearly going with her to Kurlanchik's and speaking Lithuanian with Jake. Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the many things that brought people into Kurlanchik's. They were great people. They were great, very active in the community. And I married in 1965. We bought our first couch there at Kurlanchik's, and it was shipped to New Jersey. And one of their big promotions was we deliver within 300 miles. Free delivery. Guys, I think, would go on the road for a week delivering to probably half the East Coast.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit now to your school days. Where did you go to school?
I went to I first started out, I went to Mrs. Kramer's nursery school, which was located on Main Street in the 700 block, 2 houses away from the present-day convenience store. It was a private nursery school. We didn't have kindergartens when I was growing up, and I think I went there because the influence of my Aunt Margaret, Marge as we call her. She didn't want to be called Margaret. I never called her Aunt. She always wanted to be called Marge, and that's what she was. She was a teacher, and I think that she kind of promoted me to go to that Mrs. Kramer school.
No, that wasn't Helen Kramer.
No, I don't know if they were related. I forget her first name. And then from there we went to the Washington School, which was later became Kurlanchik's warehouse, and then eventually burned, I think. It was torn down, I forget. And then I went to the junior high school, and of course Duryea High School, and graduated in 1958.
What was your grade school name?
It was the Washington School.
Okay.
There were 8 classrooms, I recall, 4 up and 4 down. And the principal's office was just a desk. The principal was Emily Regan when I was there, and she had a desk in the hallway, and we had our assemblies in the hallway. It was kind of like, I don't know how the kids all fit in there. And I remember one of the things we had to do was to recite the Gettysburg Address in front of all these kids as part of our Duryea education.
Yeah. So then you went to the high school, Duryea High School.
I went to Duryea High School. The junior high was in the Lincoln School, in the 300 block of Main Street, and then that was the 9th grade. There was a shop, there was a music room, a home ec room, and the classrooms. It was originally the high school, and then maybe the late 20s or the 30s, the high school was built up on Foote Avenue. And the kids still went to the junior high school in the 9th grade.
Okay.
And the high school was unique in itself too. And I'm sure there were other towns like that. It had no cafeteria, had no guidance office, had no gymnasium. It had classrooms and a library, and that was it. And I could talk about that a little bit later, about this in terms of the high school and sports.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
He was into all the sports.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many were in your class graduating?
I honestly don't remember the exact. I'm going to say close to 80.
Okay.
And what's interesting about of the 80 kids, there were, I think, 5 boys on Swetland Street, and 1 girl that graduated in 1958. And we had our pictures taken, and graduation exercises were held at the Holy Rosary Auditorium. A lot of the guys would sneak in the day of graduation after it was set up to see if our diplomas were signed and we graduated. And unfortunately, one of my friends didn't graduate. He was shocked too, because all the diplomers were lined up.
Yeah.
Oh, so he didn't graduate and had to repeat the year.
He never repeated. He just didn't graduate.
Oh.
So many, quite a few guys going to check that.
Oh,
and if I remember correctly, no girls.
Okay. So, after high school, or do you want to talk a little bit more about high school, or anything that you remember like that would be interesting?
I remember one of the things that was interesting. Tom Kelly, who was the football coach, was a strict disciplinarian and a very popular person in town. Went through the Duryea schools. Was a very successful athlete at St. Thomas's, which became the University of Scranton, and he was the principal and football coach. And one of his rules was that you had to take 2 books home every night. So he would stand by the door and make sure everybody carried 2 books. And one of the books, of course, was a tablet. The other was a speller, because they're the smallest ones.
But it's so interesting. I do remember Mr. Kelly.
Oh, he had a really big influence on me. He was the John Wayne of our generation in Duryea.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He was a great coach, and he was at my wedding, and I took him when he was sick. In the last days, I took both of my kids up to see him, and I remember coming back from a Lithuanian picnic in Barnesville, which was just outside of Shendo, and going up to his house and sitting there, and I said, Coach, I said, we should have a retirement party for you. And Tom, in his old way, said, yeah, I'd like that. And we had a big shindig for him at the Excelsior Hose Company. I forget the year, but he was kind of, those were his last days, more or less.
Yeah.
Oh, how nice.
And I remember sitting in there. He was brought in by Ron Killer Coase, who was one of the greater football players in Duryea history.
Yeah.
It was great.
So now, where did you meet your wife? Where did you?
I met my wife at the teachers convention in Atlantic City.
Okay, what college did you went to?
I went to King's.
King's College.
At Scranton, you had to wear a tie. At King's, you had to wear a sport coat. So I opted for King's.
Okay.
And so I was the only one from Duryea in my class that went to King's. There were some other guys from Duryea that were at King's that I knew, the Lezhevniks, for example. Jimmy Gilmartin, he became a teacher. I think he taught at Pittston. He was very active in the dispatch years ago.
Yeah.
And one of my professors was a local guy, Professor Swingle.
Oh, yes.
Frank Swingle.
In fact, Mr. Swingle, he is on the new mural in Pittston.
Oh, I'd be interested in seeing that.
He is one of the people that they honored.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons was because they said he would help everybody get into King's and help them get the funding.
Yes.
And his picture, and we can go take you to the mural in a little after this.
He taught English literature at King's. I'm an English major, so I had a lot of contact with him. And as I got older, and my wife and I, we went to the cinema club quite a bit. He would be there at the cinema club along with Tom Kelly and Henry Lee, who was the band director at Avoca. And we'd have the old-fashioned Mitch Miller sing-alongs. It was great times.
I remember the cinema club.
I always used to tell Bernie when we would work on the DuryeaPA.com website, I envied him because he grew up in the Happy Days version of Duryea. When it was still just Duryea, it hadn't merged and all that, and all the kids, they had their sweet shops and everything. Very few of them had cars, if any, so it was all local. Right. Everything was in Duryea. Now everybody goes all over, but that was the Happy Days version.
Yeah, because I was in with the merger. So I
think the last Duryea class was 1962, the last graduating class, 1962. But I did meet my wife in Atlantic City at a party, and I met the superintendent of the schools from Butler, New Jersey, so I met my wife, and I got a job at the same party, so it was pretty good.
That was a good party to go to.
We're married now, I think we're 50, I think we just had our 50th wedding anniversary in April, so we've been around a long time.
Lived out in New Jersey, then you got your job
where was
there.
she from?
She was from Scranton. She's had an Irish background. She went to Marywood. She was a home ec teacher.
What was
taught
her?
home ec, and she eventually wound up in guidance.
Yeah. What was her maiden name?
Her maiden name was Weathers, which was German, and before that, her mother was a dean from Scranton. They were Irish, and her father was on the German side, Weathers.
Now, you and your wife, do you have any relatives that are still living in the area?
No, just my two sisters and my wife's father died when she was 1, so her mother never remarried. Her mother was a teacher. Her mother was the supervisor of music in the Scranton School District at one time.
Okay, so now we're back in the school days and
Okay.
going to college. Let's talk about the sweet shops.
All right.
Okay. There was DiBiase. Now that sounds like an Italian sweet shop.
DiBiase's, right? Mrs. DiBiase made, she cooked her hamburgers in Crisco. I remember that as clear. They'd be frozen. She'd take them out of the freezer and put a big dab of Crisco in there. Boy, they were good. It was a small sweet shop. I don't even know if I could call it a sweet shop as much as it would be a restaurant.
Right.
Had 2 stools. And her son was Carmen DiBiase,
Yeah.
who eventually had the Carmen's television and radio.
Yeah. And then they had Dina's Cafe in there.
Dina's Cafe,
Yeah.
right. Before that, I think, was Skit's Pool Room, who was he married Carmen's sister. I still remember Carmen DiBiase installing the old tenor rotors.
Yeah.
Where when you got the TV, the antenna, you'd click a dial and the antenna would rotate. But during 2 channels you could get worse.
Yeah.
22 and 28, I think. We could never get Binghamton. That was channel 12.
Now, I notice here you have Duryea High School Sweet Shop. It was across from the
From the high school, that was kind of before my time. It was late 1940s, and it was called the Duryea High School Sweet Shop. And a lot of the guys went there, and I think it kind of folded up in the maybe the early 1950s. I never went there. I wasn't part of the pecking order where you know how sweet shops were. You had to be a certain age, unwritten, where you could get in. Otherwise, you just didn't go there.
Yeah.
Now, there was another place called Heron's.
Heron's was on
Donnelly.
On Donnelly Street, and I didn't go there. But that was for a different group again. That was really the only one that could compete with UHAS's, which was the hub of the universe in Duryea.
Yes, UHAS. Let's talk
40s
about
to 50s into the 60s. It was an enormous building. The building is still there. John Uhas was the cook. He made great burgers too, with the Texas wiener sauce.
So you remember how that building looked inside then?
Absolutely.
The building that's
I
there.
remember absolutely how it looked. As a matter of fact, 3 or 4 years ago, Steve Uhas, who was the son of George Uhas, took me through the building. The building had deteriorated tremendously. The roof was leaking. There was a great big hall upstairs called Uhas's Hall, and they would have union meetings there. And Cy Rickwaller, who was related to the Uhases, had a basketball hoop in the I can't call it an attic. I'll just say it was a big loft, and he would shoot in there. And the only other one that existed in Duryea indoor was at the Holy Rosary Church. Had one. They had a basketball court. I think they still do today, Holy Rosary. But Uhas's, it had the jukebox, it had the magazines, it had the candy, and John would get mad at you, and you know, we were high schools, barred for life at Uhas's. I think half the Duryea was barred for life, and John Mello the next day, it was okay, you could come back in.
And he was a big Yankees fan.
He's a big Yankees fan, absolutely. And I know I went on a number of trips to Yankee Stadium that were run by Uhas, the American Legion, Clem's Cafe. Everybody was going to the games. It was a different time.
Everybody.
Right. I remember very vividly on the bus, the guys had beer. They had an accordion player. All these guys just sing and drink, sing, and go to the game. It was fantastic.
Okay. What about Kelly's?
Kelly's was right across from Pettibone Street. That was kind of a true sweet shop in its earlier days. When I went there, they had a pinball machine, and they had a counter, and they sold. So it was kind of on its way out at that point in time.
The Blue Room? I think I've heard of the Blue Room.
The Blue Room was the center of the older people, not older, but the older teenagers during World War II.
Where was that?
That was right where, that was in the Gajewski building, which was formerly Rexcraft, which was
on Main Street.
It's on Main Street, right across from Selks. I forget what's in there now. I just drove by there today, and it was decorated in blue. And I remember, I could have been, my recollection, 6 or 7 years old, and my father parking the car across from Selks, telling me to go and get the paper. and nobody directed me across the street. I was dodging the cars, but they had a jukebox in there. It was a long, narrow bar, and eventually Irene Gutowski's drugstore was in there.
Okay.
Okay. And there's another one by the name of Lukovitz?
Lukovitz. That was toward the end of the line, across
Main
from Naylor's
Street, yeah.
garage.
Yeah.
Eddie Lukovitz, Bobby Lukovitz graduated with me in a year after me. An interesting story, he was in the football game and broke his leg. Of course, Coach Kelly said it's a mental injury. In fact, I was talking to Bobby a couple of years ago. He was a great place kicker, and he graduated, I think it was 1959. But it was a small sweet shop again. The main ones were Herons, Juhas's, and before that was the Blue Room. Blue Room was extremely popular during World War II.
So there's certainly a large list here of saloons on the main street. We covered Juhas. Where was the Blackhawk?
The Blackhawk was the upscale bar in Duryea. Started probably in the 1920s. It was started by the Kisha family, Keiza, and then they had a daughter, I think, named Sally, and Sally Kishi married Mike Robel, and Mike Robel ran the Blackhawk. It was a really upscale place. It was the boots, it was shiny, everything was shiny. He had a great big bear head up on the.
Oh, okay.
And I remember going in there when I was in college, and at that time we'd go in there for hamburgers and maybe have a beer, but it was way on it. It was on its way out there.
Yeah, that was on Main Street next to Kaminsky's.
Next to Kaminsky's,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Oh.
It's still there now, and
Yeah.
it became the Cat's Meow, I think, and I forget what it was after that, but it was.
It's still up. It's still in existence.
The building is still there.
I
Yes,
don't know
the
if
building
it's still
is
open or not.
No, it's not.
No.
It's been closed for years.
Yeah.
But Mike Robel was very active in sports, and he sponsored a lot of football teams. And one of his gimmicks, I guess this was in the 1930s, he sponsored the Duryea Indians football team, and he had a plane drop football from the plane, which was really a big deal at that point in time to get a plane.
Yeah.
You could even find a plane.
Yeah.
Where they go from, I don't know. Let me say one more thing about Mike. His daughter was Marie Pregman, who was the teacher in the Duryea school system. She was a phys ed teacher. She might be still living. She lives in Wyomissing, which is just outside of Reading. And she was the phys ed teacher in Duryea schools, maybe in the mid-50s or so. And Mike had a diamond tie pin, white shirt, and diamond studs when he tended bar. And that's the way. That's why I say it was upscale.
Yeah.
He's like the kind of guy you'd see
Sure.
in the 1890s at Delmonico's in New York. And he drove a Cadillac. We have a Cadillac on the Duryea website, which Mike and I started back about 10 years ago. And he had a Cadillac, a convertible, Cadillac convertible, and people would just. He was a big deal. He was what we call, I guess today, a mover and a shaker.
Very notable person.
Absolutely.
And I think the Polish Falcons are still there.
Polish Falcons was club. I don't know when it started, but it was there since probably the 20s. It was one of those benevolent associations. I didn't go in there that often, but one of my friends supposedly they served steamed clams, and he had 48 dozen clams at the Polish Falcons.
Wow.
It was a neighborhood bar, and that's another thing. The bars were very neighborhoody, if that's the correct word.
Yeah.
You didn't go. You went to your favorite bar. I guess they were all Cheers bars, only they were Lithuanian, Polish, Irish. We didn't have many Italians, Mary and Duryea. The few of them that I knew were Martinelli's, was one group. They lived. They kind of clustered a little bit towards Upper Main Street, but there weren't many families. The DiBiase's were obviously Italian, but it was Lithuanian, Polish, Welsh, and Irish. That's the way I remember.
Now, what church did the Welsh people go to? Do you remember?
I would think that they went to the Brick Methodist Church. That's what I would think. And there was another church on Marcy Street, a smaller church. I can't think of the name of it offhand. The building is still there, right by the river. Mike, you might know it. There's a business in there now. I forget, the name escapes me.
Oh, I know what one you mean. I used to think it was where the Jewish synagogue was.
Yeah.
But that was on Holden. But you're right. Yeah, it's down the bottom there. I think we have a picture of it on the Duryea site.
We do.
I can't think of the name of that one though.
The Jewish synagogue, the Black Diamond Fire Company, was started by the Jewish merchants in Duryea, maybe 1910, and these numbers are all a little rough, but Duryea, they had so many fires they couldn't get insurance because there was no fire company, and there was a fire every night, and so the Jewish merchants started the Black Diamond Fire Company, and they had the fire company on Newton Street, which is right in the center of the Duryea Business Street.
Yeah.
That was the hub. From Stevenson Street down to Swetland Street, that was the whole Duryea center of commerce.
Now, there was a Stiroh saloon.
Stiroh's was at the end of the line, was right next to Solarchik's. It eventually became Nolan's, Eleanor Nolan. She was from the 5th Ward, I think. Right.
On Main Street?
Yes.
Okay.
At the last one down now is Iran. And then right next to that, going toward Pittston, was Steers, which became Eleanor Nolan's, which was Eleanor played the keyboard, and it was kind of a place for older people in there. And then that was knocked down to make parking lots.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the American Legion, because they were in every town, the
American Legion, as a college kid, I hung out there a lot because my friends that went to King's hung out there. It was I had a lot of fond memories of the American Legion. They had shuffleboard. We played cards, had a jukebox, and at that time it was all guys. I hardly ever saw a woman in the American Legion. They sponsored the American Legion Little League baseball team, which I was part of the American Legion Little League baseball team. And one of the treats after a Little League game was to go to the basement of the American Legion and get soda for shepheritis. And you can only get chaser or ginger ale. They never did flavors because that's what they used to mix the drinks.
Yeah, shepheritis. They used to deliver to the homes.
Yep. Yes.
The VFW too. Were you in the
VFW? Was originally in the Kaminsky building.
Oh.
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a long, narrow building. It was part of the building, but it was partitioned.
Yeah.
And I think I don't remember what was on the other side, but it was a long, narrow building, and that was there. I know it was there into the 1950s. The vets might have been built in the circa 1960, 1962, and they moved to Stevenson Street.
And that's where the old magazine used to be, the old
correct.
magazine field.
Yes.
Yeah.
And upstairs over the vets was Dr. Everett's office.
Right.
And I think there was a beauty parlor, Lena's, that was right next to Dr. Everett's. Dr. Everett was he was the only dentist in town at the time when I was growing up. And it would be great. Saturday mornings, everybody would be lined up on that Dr. Everett.
Yeah.
And he was just a great guy. His wife was Ida Mae Wickesall, who was a teacher in the Duryea public school systems. They were an old family, the Wickesalls. But Doc Everett said a lot of people didn't have money, and they paid in eggs and chickens. That's true. Those are true stories.
Sure.
I think a filling might have been $3, and extraction was 50 cents, so everybody went for the extraction because it was cheaper.
Yeah.
That's why we didn't have all of our teeth.
Right. Yeah.
I think it was like that back then. You should.
Yep.
Now, what about the Moritz? I believe the Moritz is still there.
Moritz started. I'm not too familiar with the Moritz. That was early on. It was owned by the Kromowskis.
Kromowski, yeah.
Owned it at one time. Then Joe Williams took it over, the Moritz, and I'm not that familiar with it.
Okay.
But that's on the corner of Lackawanna Avenue and Main Street. The building is still there.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Now, you never got up to Kelly's bar.
No, I never got
up
up to Kelly's. That was a really, really neighborhood bar.
Yeah.
My father, who lived on Columbia Street as a kid growing up, he didn't really go to Kelly's. It later became the Gamma Club. I always think of that as I can't say an Irish bar because there weren't that many Irish in that section of Duryea. The Irish are more on the way I think up on Foote Avenue toward York Avenue in that area. But Tom Kelly owned it, and they eventually moved it. They picked it up. They picked up Kelly's bar. It was attached to the house at one time. And X number of guys, they picked it up and moved it 15 or 20 feet away from the house. That's how, because it was too noisy for Aldona and the kids. So they just. We have a lot of pictures on the Duryea website of the Gamma Club, and at that time, Tom Kelly was the the principal, and everybody was there. Like, they had the turkey dinner, the fish dinner, the venison dinner, the rabbit dinner, every kind of.
New Year's Eve
but
parties.
they did not have pierogi dinners or pigs in a blanket up
No.
there. It was strictly game type things.
It's nice growing up in little towns
Yeah.
because everybody just sort of stayed there, and you knew everybody that was in town.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Getting back to the main street, there was a couple clothing stores. Leader store.
Leader store was originally was right next to Selk's. That would have been in the 500 block, and was right next to it. And then they eventually moved next to Fidala's drugstore, which was right next to Kennedy's, which was on Dixon Street. Selk's was a big-time department store. Might have employed 5 people at one time, or 6 people.
Yeah.
And Isidore Selk, and I think it was Minnie. She might have been Sammy Goldstein's sister, if I'm not mistaken. But I went in there and bought stuff, and she was nice. After maybe the 1960s, she took me upstairs, and she had to her apartment. It was very ornate.
Now,
they lived upstairs.
Yeah, most of them lived upstairs from their businesses, probably, on the main street.
And that was in operation. When you walked past Selk's, they had an outdoor showroom that when you walked in, there was a showcase on the outside, so you could actually walk in, and the showroom, the showcase, was on the outside of the street.
Wow.
And if I'm not mistaken, if there are some decorations that are still from the sidewalk that you could see in Duryea, right?
What about the tailor shop, Dumas Tailor?
Dumas Tailors, they were right on the corner of Newton Street. I spoke with Harold Dumas a couple of years ago. He's still living. That's the son of the original Dumas Tailor. And they were a tailor shop, and you got your pants pressed. We didn't get much work done there because my grandmother was a seamstress. She worked at Nathan's in Pittston as a seamstress, and she worked at Samter's in Scranton at one time.
Oh, yeah.
So she learned this trade when she was working for Dr. Dobson in Wilkes-Barre as a young domestic. She learned to sew, and so we didn't get much work done. But it was a small tailor shop, and I just can't imagine how much business they would have because I don't know the people that could afford to take their clothes there to get altered.
What about American Store Groceries? Is that part of an original chain?
It was called the A&P, and I think at that point in time it might have been part of the chain, but it was very small, and they had two. They moved. I remember the clerk's name was Mary for whatever.
Where were they at?
It became Cunningle's Paint Store after the A&P store.
Okay.
We have pictures of on the website. I remember going in there, and they were right next to the Pastime Theater too.
Yeah.
At one time.
What memories do you have of the Pastime?
Well, the admission was 12 cents, and if you went after 5, it was 18. And I remember the double features, the Cowboys. And one of my earliest memories of that is going with my father to see it, because we only lived 3 minutes. We take the back alley up, and we were there going to see a Tarzan movie at the Pastime. It was on its way out. I think it might have closed in the late 50s. The old-time ushers, they were dressed with suits on, and they had a popcorn machine and a candy machine. And one of the big things was to shoot spitballs with rubber bands through the light of the movie, so it would look like a meteor going across.
Yeah, on the screen you'd see it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That was a big attraction, and that was kind of territorial too, because depending upon your age, you sat in this section or you sat in that section. The kids were down the front, and the adults, of course, were in the back. And I remember the Dracula movies as being a big attraction there too.
Okay, you have here, there's another meat market.
Let me say one more thing about that, Mary. In the back of the movie was a place called Bunker Hill, which was a hill because when they dug the foundation out for the movie, it became a hill, and we would go there and we would sleigh ride, and it couldn't have been more than 8 feet high or 10 feet high. And I remember vividly skiing with the wooden slats from the barrels. We'd tie a rope around them and kind of ski down this little hill. That was called Bunker Hill. And that was, there were 3 movies in Duryea at one time.
Really? What were the other names of them?
I think one was Dreamland, and one was owned by a guy named Babbage. There were 3 of them. Levy's Bakery, I'm pretty sure it was a movie at one time. If you notice now, it's kind of, the building itself is cockeyed or slanted.
Yeah.
And that was a movie, and there's And the place next to, there's a doctor's office there now in Duryea. That was, and there was one across from the American Legion. So there were 3 of them.
There are some listings here you have behind the bridge. What about the dike to Coxton Road?
Behind the bridge, across the river, was
We
a
call
big
it the
attraction.
swamps now.
Mike goes there himself now. It's an attraction. That was a big attraction across the bridge or over the river.
Yeah.
And
The Echo House.
the Echo House was a big. The Echo House is a round circular building made of concrete that we would go, and hundreds of people went there, and you'd carve your name in there into the concrete, or Joe loves Mary, or Mary loves Joe, whatever the case might be. And it had slots on it, like little bars on it, and I did some research on it, and it was a watering for the locomotives at one time, a watering reservoir, if you will.
Yeah.
For that, and that was a really big attraction. Right next to that, on the other side of the post road, was Soldier Hill, which was very clear memories of that. It was kind of meadowy, you had the hill, and it was a very steep incline, and we would sleigh ride there, and we would just roll down the hill because it was like being on a mattress. I don't know why it was like that, but we just rolled down. Who could roll the farthest without stopping? That was the whole idea. Of course, you're pretty dizzy by the time.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, and I've been trying to rack my brain with this, that it's got its name from the soldiers in 1902. A lot of people don't know that Duryea was occupied by the Pennsylvania National Guard because of the 1902 coal strikes. And they were quartered up right next to the Marcy Cemetery, just on the border of Old Forge and Duryea. There's a plant there, a manufacturing plant.
Golden or something.
I don't know what it is, Mike. And for some reason, I have a lot of articles on it. They marched down to Duryea, and then they marched down to Coxton and crossed the Coxton Bridge, took the dike along the river, and they took that road, followed the railroad tracks by Number 10 Tunnel, and I think they might have camped there or bivouacked there or something, and that's how it's got its name, Soldier Hill.
All right.
It was a really, really big attraction, and the National Guard was in Duryea probably 10 days or 14 days.
Yeah.
And they would have drills, and the people would be there with their flags, and the band would be playing. They would be marching, and of course they got into town too on leave.
Yeah.
Sure.
And they spent a lot of money in
the saloon.
and there were a lot of fights.
That's a good story.
And the commander, I forget his name, but he got sick and he died in Scranton, which was a big deal. He was from Reading.
So that was the strike of the 1902 with the miners.
1902, correct.
Isn't that when Roosevelt and John Mitchell and
around
Father
I
Curran?
don't know the exact date, Mary, but it was around that time,
And we literally made national news because I have copies of articles from newspapers across the country because it affected everybody. New York City was in a panic. Yeah, we had a big impact on
I tried to contact the various newspapers in New York trying to get a picture of the regiment in Duryea, and of course I couldn't get one. But there are pictures in the Tribune, Scranton Tribune, or the Scranton Times, whatever it was at the time, of the different regiments in West Pittston, let's say, because they were in the area. But I could never get a picture of that of Duryea.
I'd like to just say that John Mitchell was just such a wonderful union leader, and he helped the miners tremendously. And there is a statue of him up in the courthouse square. And I recently read a book about St. Peter's Cathedral in Scranton, and in there it shows all the people, when John Mitchell died, they had his funeral there, and all the people all around the streets were waiting to get in there. And I believe, according to the book, that was the first time that a bishop actually spoke about the person that was deceased at their funeral because of what John Mitchell did for the miners. So I just wanted to add that. What about Peekaboo?
Peekaboo was a patch, a mining patch in Duryea, right next to the Babylon Breaker. When you cross over the Stevenson Street Bridge, about 100 yards to the right was the Babylon Breaker. And as you go up the mountain, not too far from the original Babylon Breaker, was this little settlement called Peekaboo. It might have had 8 or 10 homes I have never been able to get a picture of Peekaboo. I know a few people who have them, and I just haven't gotten, they never got around to sending me that.
Now, while we're across the bridge,
Mm-hmm.
the baseball and football field used to be over there on the left. As you go
Correct.
over the bridge, right
That's
to the
right,
left
Mike.
there.
Yeah.
You never played there.
Yes.
Oh, you did play games
Oh, yeah. I played Little League there.
Okay.
The Little League, I think, started in 1951 in Duryea, and they built a field there, and there was there were a lot of discussions about should the field be there because of its location. It wasn't centrally located.
Right.
And the powers to be, I think the Gamma Club might have been involved in it, perhaps the Lions Club, I'm not sure. But they felt that it was also dangerous for kids going over by the bridge and by the river. I know one of my friends, he didn't play baseball, but he would hide by the river and wait for the foul balls to go over so he could catch the foul balls.
Yeah.
And that was a really nice field in its day. And before that, it was called Legion Park, which was started by the American Legion circa 1920. These dates are all within a year or two.
Yeah.
It was called Legion Park, which was the home of the Duryea Indians, played there, various professional, semi-pro baseball teams, football teams, rodeos, pigeon shoots. And I did read an article that this was in the 1920s, that there were over 7,000 people attended a mass on the Feast of the Annunciation. So it was a big gathering spot, and they had field days there from the schools. There'd be like hundreds of kids would be at this field.
Wow.
And then it went into, and there was also an issue about when they built it that it would be used for stripping, which eventually it was used for, and it was washed out. The field was washed out in the 1955 flood, Hurricane Diane.
Yeah.
Okay.
Along with the bridge.
The bridge was washed out also, right?
That was the metal one. Yeah.
Let me make a comment on that, on the 55 flood, as we're kind of transgressing a little bit, but my parents ran a concession up at Lake Sheridan for the summer. It was like a pavilion type thing, and my father felt that was a great place for us to have a vacation. We could work, and we could also have water, so we went up there, and we lived there during the summer. And in 1955, at that time, he had gotten a job. He went out to work for Alcoa Aluminum in Edison, New Jersey. But anyhow, I was back for football practice in 55. It was August 16th or 17th. And the river started rising, and I was there with a great aunt of mine who was babysitting me. Of course, I had to be babysat at 16. But anyhow, she was there and watching, and the river was rising, and the neighbor said that we should put up all of our furniture up on tables, carried the TV upstairs, but it helped to a degree. But we did get 6 feet of water through our entire first floor. So after that water receded, we were left with all the mud, and it took years to get the smell out of the house.
Yeah.
The whole thing had to be wallpapered, etc. And another sidebar to that is, at football practice, Coach Kelly decided, well, we couldn't have water. The water was contaminated. You had to get shots, typhoid shots or whatever, so you get shots. And you couldn't drink the water. And Coach Kelly decided it would be a good time to stop the water at the practices. So here it is, 16th or 17th or 18th of August. Nobody could drink water. So we'd lose 8 or 10 pounds out of practice. It was really great. And to the day I graduated, we never had water at practices. So it went on for 3 years. And that was the schooling. Coach Kelly was in the Navy, I think. And he was a product of the basic training, the boot training. And he always reminded me of the coach from Alabama, Bear Bryant.
Bear Bryant,
Yeah, that's what he reminded me of. But we never had water. And one of the stigmas attached to the flood was you got shirts from the Red Cross, and they were checkered shirts. So if you wore a checkered shirt to school, it was like the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
Oh, he was in the flood.
Yeah.
So we didn't like to wear those. I think we got shoes too, but everything was lost in the flood. It was a very traumatic experience, and we were lucky, probably than most people had a lot more damage to
Some of their houses went down. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess back in that area too, when we were going back behind the bridge, there was a farm there, Kresge Farm.
There was a farm up on the mountain. You could access it from Number 10 Tunnel. Mike, you might know, when you go up to the dams, the Campbell's Lake, can you go where Number 10 Tunnel was?
Yeah.
There used to be a road.
Yeah, you can't drive up there anymore, though.
Right.
They'll arrest you.
We used to go up that path.
Yeah, we walked up there
and then as you went up to the first dam in Campbell's Ledge, if you veer to the right, that would be what was called Kresge's Road, by the way.
Okay.
And then there was a farm there called Hunga's Farm, and he was quote a Hun, whatever that means. I know what it means, but how we got Hunga, I don't know. And we would go up there too for walks to the farm. At that point, it was just in the 50s, it was just kind of a shack that was destroyed more or less. Yeah. And I remember they had apples there, those little crab apples. And one of the big games was we would play with my friends who would get sticks, and we'd have sides, and you'd get a stick and you'd take a knife and you sharpen it at the end, and you put the crab apple on the end and see who could hit the guy in the head. Great games we had.
Yeah. So it was like paintball, only with apples.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No protective gear.
That's right. That's right.
Now, wait a minute.
And let me say one more thing. Speaking of Kresge's, there was a Kresge's stripping hole, which we were all forbidden to go to, especially me, because I had an uncle who was drowned. That was my entire life was, don't go near the river, don't go near the river, don't go near the river. And I remember this very clear. It was right by the farm, and the water was crystal clear. It had a greenish tone to it. And we would go there, and we'd swim naked. We'd jump into the water and just jump out and then walk down again. And that was called Kresge's Pond, we called it. And that was on the way to the dams. You know, first dam, second dam, third dam.
And the water was greenish, and you were in there.
It had a greenish. I was thinking something in the for that.
Who knows what was in there?
But we didn't care. It was a great way to cool off.
Was this near the Simpson Patch and the Keyhole Breaker?
Simpson's Patch is in back of the Keyholes.
Over in Max's, where Max's bar used to be, in that way, like almost by the old Forge line.
If you followed if you went between Keyhole Birch Breaker and the mountain, that's Simpson's Patch.
Okay.
The Tinkopaws lived there. Herman Tinkopaw, who graduated a year before me, who was very supportive of our website.
Is that where Hagnati has his stripping going on in there now?
Mike, I honestly don't know because, but you could drive to Herman Tinkopaw's.
Okay.
You could go right down and you come to Pagnati Park and you make a left and it takes you back there.
Okay.
There are about 3 or 4 homes there now. They're deserted.
Right.
But Herman still lives there.
Okay.
And that was called Simpson's Patch. And if you went, the kids from Simpson's Patch used to walk to school to Duryea. They would walk the tracks. From there, the track up, cross over to Stevenson Street Bridge, because Herman's mother graduated with my mother in 1934. She talked about how they would walk along the tracks.
So they're all the kids from Coxton in that area.
Coxton kids were bused. They had, I don't know how many they were at the time when I was there, maybe 10, 12, 14 kids. They were bused from Coxton. But Simpson's Patch kids had to walk. And that was a section of Duryea. They had its own school at one time. I never had a picture of it.
Yeah.
There was a school there.
Oh, was it? Now, did they have clam bakes and picnics back there? Or?
Across the bridge, as I said, was an attraction. Families would have picnics there. American Legion would have a picnic there. I know Belavich's Bar had picnics there. There was an area 300 or 400 yards from the Stevenson Street Bridge that was kind of nice. And there was a trough that came out from the mines, I assume, up on the mountain, and it dumped water. It went from the mountain right into the river. And between that and the baseball field is where the Easter egg hunts. They would have Easter egg hunts there.
Oh.
It's a entirely different area right now.
Oh, yeah.
Most people wouldn't even.
No.
And they were calling them back there.
Yeah.
It was a nice area, but I said it was a very definite attraction for people to cross the bridge. And on Sundays, people would go with their jackets and ties.
Now where was Shokwit Park?
Shokwit Park.
Shokwit, yeah.
Shokwit Park was a big attraction. It was located in back of the 800 block of Duryea, up by Auravans, across from Naylor's garage.
Okay.
And there was a great big stairway that came down from the street to Shookwood Park. They had there at one time a dance hall, a bowling alley. They had orchestras. They had dance bands there on Wednesday night, Saturday night, right by the river. And it was owned by John Shookwood, I think it was. He was also a musician who had a band. The foundation was there when I was a kid growing up. It was, but the building itself was long gone. I've never been able to get a picture of it.
I have some ads from the newspapers about different events that were going on there.
Yes, a lot of ads. It was a big deal. And the Polish Falcons had a big convention there with kids from the Holy Rosary, the Polish, and that was probably in the 1930s. And we used to play baseball there. One of my earliest memories of Marcy Park, we played baseball all the time. We played baseball on the street, in the alley. We played tackle in the alley. It was great. There was rats and glass and nobody cared. And basketball, of course, we had the hoops on the street. But we played baseball. I remember Art Cunningham, who belonged to the American Legion. He became the American Legion baseball coach, and great all-around person, really nice guy. He would come and he'd scout it there, and he'd watch us play baseball, and he'd take out and who they would draft for the first Little League team. So, and I remember I didn't know if I was going to get drafted or whether I even get picked. And I remember being upstairs, looking out the window, and Art Cunningham came in his green, it was a light green car, and he had the uniform. I was thrilled as could possibly be to get picked to play that team.
Now, did you have son Art?
Yes, Art.
Because I graduated with his son.
Yes, that was his son. Art. The Cunninghams were around early in Duryea too. I'd say early. I mean, probably the early 1900s. Art Cunningham. He lived up on Donnelly Street at the time. He was very active in the Lions Club and a really nice guy.
Yeah. Do you ever remember going to Campbell's Ledge when you were a kid?
Yeah, either Campbell's Ledge or how about Falling Springs? Either of those.
All right. Campbell's Ledge, we went up there, and I was always afraid to get too close to that ledge.
Yeah.
I really was. And some of the guys we played like Daredevil, who could get the closest. And I remember there was a boy from Duryea, Kasulis, that fell off there and got killed.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes, and that was probably in the 1940s or the 30s. And so I was a little bit leery of it, to tell you the truth, and a lot of people were. The ledge. And then from there we went up to the second dam, and of course from there you went to the third dam. We had the ragmen that came around. The Iron Man, whatever you want to call them.
The huckster, the ragman,
And we sold iron for a penny a pound. Copper might have been 5 or 6 cents a pound. So I had this great idea, and I was maybe 10 or 12. I'm going to make it simple. I'm going to get my wagon, and I'm going to take it to number 10 tunnel, which was a pretty good hike. It was across the bridge, probably a good mile, if not more. Pulled it all the way down to number 10 tunnel, and I'm loading up with brake shoes from the railroads, the big pieces of iron. So I had the thing where I could just about pull it. And who comes along but the railroad detective? His name was Scanner.
Oh, okay. Skatunas.
And he had a gun. And there I was, 10 or 12 years old, with this wagon full of brake shoes that I would sell for a penny a pound, make a fortune. And he scared the living daylights out of me. If you come back again here, I'm going to shoot you. And I pulled that wagon as fast as I could pull. I threw all the iron off and pulled that wagon. I cried all the way home.
Oh, gosh.
And my mother said, "Why are you crying?" Nothing happened.
Right.
No, it was no big deal.
Get in trouble.
Tell your mother anything, right? Well, Jesus, that was interesting. Getting back to some of the Main Street business, you want to talk a little bit about the doctors that were in town?
Well, as I said, we had Dr. Everett was the dentist, and he was from, I think, from the Stroudsburg area when he came here. Okay, Duryea was back in the 1920s, the late teens. It was a place to start a practice, and doctors. There were tons of doctors. I just picked the ones that I was familiar with in my time, and. Of course, Dr. Horvath, who was a local boy, he was the one who treated everybody for everything. He was a great person. The Horvath family, his father was Rudolph, he was on the Board of Education. They owned a mercantile building, which was right next to the old Duryea Lumber Company. And he and his wife, I forget his wife's name, they had their first office that I remember was in the Shimley building across from the old Pastime Theater. And he did it all. After the football games, Coach Kelly would say, anybody have to go to the doctors? And if you had enough gumption to say yes, when you went down to Dr. Horvath's. You had mentioned, Mike, the skating rink, the magazine. Again, a lot of my memories go back to that time period of 10, 12 years old. Maybe I was 10 or 12, and I remember they just filled it. And I remember skating. I knelt down, and I knelt on an open tin can and got a big gash in my knee. So my friend ran home to tell my mother that Bernard, that's what I was called, Bernard.
Yeah.
I wasn't called Bernard, I was called Bernard, got cut. And she said, well, tell him to go to Dr. Horvath. That was the extent of it. Not, well, tell him to come home, Ralph. I mean, he just went.
Yeah.
And I remember going to Dr. Horvath's and getting stitched, and they put on what was called methylate. It must have been some kind of it burned. Like it burned for weeks. But it was a pretty good antiseptic.
Now, do you know how the magazine field got its name?
Well, I've had a couple different versions on that, Mike. One that it was a place to store powder for the coal mines. That, I think, is the consensus of how it got its name. And there was a powder, in fact, I have a map someplace on the Duryea website that shows powder.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it got its name.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, too, about that magazine field, the 4 houses that are still around, 5 houses in a row on Brown Street, the other ones, they were there in the 1910.
Well, the magazine field was there.
Yeah.
Or the powder.
That was that was a big comb dump on both sides of it. And the one house, if you notice, is facing a different way. 4 are lined up and one's back. They were there at that time.
Speaking of the coal mines, do you know remember where the Babylon coal mine was?
Yeah, the Babylon was across from the bridge on the right-hand side, about 100 yards.
Over the Stevenson Street Bridge.
Over the Stevenson Street Bridge. It burned a couple different times. I think a lot of these places, this is where the guys walk to work. If you've ever seen the movie,
Molly Maguire's?
No, not the Molly Maguire's, the one from Wales. How Green Was My Valley? How Green Is My Valley?
Yeah.
It shows the men walking to work, and that's how I picture Duryea to be. With 6 collieries or 6 breakers, all within a radius of a couple miles, I could picture all these guys going to work in the morning.
Yeah.
Because there was the Halstead.
Halstead was in back of where the Hillcrest development is. Going to school, we walked up what was called a pass. It was a road from Main Street up to the school, where the present day convenience store is. And we'd walk up the pass, and that would take you to. It was called a pass because there were combs on both sides. And then there was also the shaft that was there, with a couple timbers across it. So on the way to school, of course, we always had to stop and throw rocks down and see how long it would take to get down there. It's amazing no one ever got hurt in that.
Exactly.
And then there was the Barnum.
The Barnum, of course, is where Glotchik's car shop would be. Yeah, that was. There's some question whether that's in. It's in Duryea. It's part of it might be. So that goes back a long time. And there was a Barnum who had a grist mill. It was great for picking blueberries.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
I don't know if they're. No, I guess it's all different now.
It's all Blueberry Hill Estate now.
There you go. I never made the connection.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
In fact, they're expanding that back to where the Pittston dump used to be. So they think it might one day connect with Union Street in that area there somewhere. So we'll see.
There's a Barnum Street, which is right there too, by right across from the St. Joseph Cemetery in that area.
Yeah. How about the Phoenix Breaker?
The Phoenix Breaker, when you come down Main Street, and just before you get up on the Viaduct, it was on the right-hand side.
Right.
The Phoenix, at the foot of Chittenden Street. That burned, I think, in circa 1900s, and then it became the Phoenix Washery, maybe in the 1920s. So, there was a breaker called the Columbia, which was right in between Phoenix Street and Main Street, where the dollar store is now.
Or
Mr. G's or whatever it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a big. So there were 3 enormous comb banks in there.
What about the Columbia?
That's the one I'm referring to.
Yeah.
That's between Phoenix Street and Main Street, and that was well before maybe 1890s. It was there.
And the Keyhole Berg, where was that one?
The Keyhole Berg was right across from St. Mary's Cemetery, which is on Pettibone Street in Duryea.
Okay.
Right across. I think the dump. Is the dump still there? Yeah, I get confused because I remember as a kid it was a great big enormous thing,
No.
and we would always see who could fly a kite from Swetland Street over at Keogh. And my grandmother, who lived on Columbia Street, my father's mother, made carpets, and she sold carpets. And I always got the carpet string, which was a lot stronger than the regular string that you would buy.
Kite string,
Yeah, kites were fun.
They were great, Mary.
Yeah.
They were.
You know, we had fun with kites.
Yeah.
Really were.
We'd have them go so far, and you couldn't see them. Oh, mine's over the dump. Is it really? Yeah, I can't even see it.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really a nice.
It was a big attraction.
Yeah,
it was.
It was
fun. Speaking of what were some of the other kids' games that you used to play?
It was basically Relievo or Relievo was a big one, and that was. And I remember. It's funny how things come to my mind, but the boundaries we set up for the high school. I lived on Swetland Street. Where you go as far as the high school, you could go to Old Forge, all the way to Pittston, and of course you could never go more than 2 blocks.
Yeah,
but as kids, those are the boundaries that we set.
Sure. You stayed right in your own neighborhood with the kids you grew up with.
And there was a very definite rivalry with the basketball hoops. A couple guys on Swetland Street put up 2 baskets right almost at the top of Swetland Street by Main Street. The Bartnikoski brothers, Ed and Joe, were 2 of the guys. Some of them that put it up. They put the 2 baskets up on telephone poles. They actually put the poles in, and the baskets, and the street was tilted. So one basket was 10 feet high, the other one was 9 feet 6 inches high. Yeah. And we'd have games that we played constantly. And I remember Coach Kelly coming down and sitting in that car and watching who's gonna. That was a really big thing. And there were hoops almost on every corner.
Yeah. It was fun. What about? Do you remember? I remember anyway when we were kids. Rocky Glen. Wasn't that a big place where
it was a big place.
Go?
My first date was I met a girl from Cemetery Street, Rosemary Hannon, and Paul Urban, and his date. Paul was a good friend of mine. Walked from Duryea, met the girl on Cemetery Street, which is right off McCall Park, and walked to Rocky Glen.
Wow!
And that was thought nothing of it. My wife used to take the Laurel line down. Rocky Glen was great. The swimming, and in fact, I quite often talk to my wife about the French fries. I remember the French fries at Rocky Glen, bottom of the hill, the right-hand side. We'll talk. I still remember the guy who made them, Joe Arbicheski. He lived across the street, and they were the greasiest, tastiest French fries you could possibly get.
Yeah, and they got little tickets. Yes. I mean, you got everything with these little tickets. I mean, it really wasn't expensive to go there.
And the duck was good. That was always a fun ride.
Yeah.
I don't think I went on the coaster that much. I wasn't a coaster person.
I remember the tumble bug. Remember the
Yes, I did go swimming in the lake quite a bit. If you took a date, you'd go swimming there. But that was I do remember walking there. I don't know how long it took.
It was so much fun. Love in the dark.
Yeah.
The fun house.
Tunnel of Love too. The guns. They had the shooting gallery. I can almost picture as soon as you walk up
the Ferris wheel.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun. The teacups.
Yeah.
So with that same idea, the church picnics had carnival rides. Actually, Germania probably had the best. They didn't have much in the way of rides. I remember the guy came around with the whip truck. That was a big attraction. There was a whip with about 4 cars on it. And the church picnics were always a treat with the games, the carnival-type games that they had at Rocky Glen.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was fun, Rocky Glen.
Marty Wanalist's father from Avoca, the 5th Ward, he ran one of those where you throw the ball, you can knock over the owl or whatever it was, you can never knock it over.
Right, yeah.
Can never win.
Okay, let's talk about a little bit more on Main Street. Dill's Funeral.
Dill's Funeral Home goes way back, turn of the century.
Oh.
1890s. I can't think of the person's first name, but Diltz. And anyhow, he was a pretty good long-distance runner. He won a lot of contests in Duryea racing. And then it was taken over, I think, by his mother, Mary Diltz, whose son, Joe Diltz, took over the business. And then Joe's brother, Frank, had it when it was on Main Street in Duryea. Diltz was right across from Levy's Bakery when I was a kid growing up.
Okay.
Right next to the old Duryea Silk Mill. The Duryea Silk Mill was a big industry in Duryea in the 1940s.
Yeah.
And then it became the American Chain and Cable Company. And my father got a job at the American Chain and Cable. The mines were kind of on their way out then. after the war, I know the Knox mine disaster had a lot to do with it later on too. But they were really phasing out. Once the guys came home from the war, a lot of them went to Connecticut, New Jersey, like wherever. They just dispersed for sure. But and then the American Chain and Cable came in, and he worked there, and it was a very strenuous job. They could only work 6-hour shifts. They made submarine nets. So you physically had to turn the wire by hand to make these mesh nets, and the pay was good. I think it might have been at the time maybe $4 or $5 an hour or something. It was pretty good pay for that time period.
Right.